Hi, I'm Effie and this is What Effie Reads. If you've watched some of my videos before, there's a fair chance you will have heard me speak about the Saga of Darren Shan. And every time I bring it up, it's always with the caveat that I'm due for a reread and I don't know how it holds up. So I thought I would bring you along on the journey of me rereading them.
Pitch black hair, his eyes are green. Head's messed up, but heart so clean.
Now my plan is over the next wee while to put out a video for each of the books. This is going to be the first video in the series, and I'll be talking about the first book in this anthology, which is called Cirque Du Freak. And this video won't contain spoilers, but please be aware that future videos are going to contain spoilers as we move through the series. Kind of content warnings is that there is a tarantula quite prominently featured in these books, so if arachnids are not your thing, these books may not be for you. And also this book, trigger warnings for death of an animal. I'm more than happy to provide more information if anyone's interested, and same for the other trigger of like death and danger of death to a child. I think that's all of the potential triggers that I've picked up on, but if I think of any more, please do check the description. The majority of the footage for this video comes from around a year ago when I first started rereading this series. However, ahead of putting this video up, I have subsequently reread the first book again. So let's cut back to past Effie and hear all of my thoughts on Cirque Du Freak. One of the first series of books that I remember getting very excited for new releases and staying up into the very early hours of the morning reading, desperate to know how the books turned out, were the Saga of Darren Shan, which I believe is sometimes renamed the Cirque Du Freak series, but as I was growing up, they were always known as the Saga of Darren Shan. They are written by Darren Shan, and I just have really fond memories of them. I should probably explain a little bit about this series. So the first book was first published in 2000. So this series, or at least the first book, is a little over 20 years old. And it follows our protagonist, Darren Shan, as he is forced into becoming a half vampire. And he also ends up thrust into this kind of vampire war. So the first book is the events that lead up to him having to become a half vampire. And then we slowly learn more and more about this world. And I believe the trilogy after this one follows kind of vampire politics. But all along, the books are gearing up towards this big battle. And I remember there being lots of twists and turns. And this series was one that, despite being middle grade, did not pull punches. I have already started my reread, and I've decided that this time around I'm going to annotate them. So as you can see, I have started reading a little bit of this. So far, I am tabbing for emotional or sad moments, foreshadowing, and character introductions. So you can see these fuchsia tabs are the character introductions. And obviously you meet a lot of characters very early on, so there's a lot of them. I've only got one emotional tab, and that was in the very introduction. And the foreshadowing, obviously, I can see because I know what's coming in the series. But I probably didn't pick up on the first time around. So it's very exciting to kind of notice all these little things that I didn't notice when I first read them. But so far, I am around 50 pages into Cirque Du Freak, the first book in the series. Apologies for my pronunciation. I've never been very good at pronouncing French. And we're just being introduced to all of the characters who make up the Cirque Du Freak. And I am loving it, especially as I've picked up on a few things that I either forgot about or that I just didn't notice. Something that I picked up on last night is there's actually a Pennywise reference in this book, which means that the author's done something I love and included references for adult readers or older audiences, despite this being a middle grade book, which I very much appreciate. And one of the first things that I remembered when I was reading this book is one of the characters' names is Steve Leopard, and his first name is actually Leonard, but he is repeatedly referred to as Leopard, to the point that I think you forget that that isn't actually his surname. And when I was first reading these books, I read them when I was actually the target age, so middle grade. I was at school and I had a teacher called Mr. Leopard, and if I remember correctly, his first name was also Steve. So I had this little headcanon of thinking that my teacher was actually this character. And I think part of that as well is the fact that these books having a protagonist with the same name as the author, and also the way that they say this might be unbelievable, but it was a true story, it created that level of doubt in my mind that I was going, maybe this was true. Which sounds bonkers as an adult, but I think as a child you want to believe the absurd, and this book had just enough believability that you question it and go, maybe this could be real. I don't know. I love this series, and I'm hoping that I continue to love this series as I reread it, as I am overdue for a reread, so I'm a little bit scared about what I think about it now. I've now finished Cirque Du Freak, which is the first book in the Vampire Blood trilogy, and so far this series is pretty much holding up, which makes me really, really happy. I have been putting kind of post-its throughout, and I've been tabbing. So I'm currently tabbing for emotional and sad scenes, foreshadowing, character introductions, important moments, and moments or quotes that I just love. And there's quite a lot of character introductions. It's the kind of fuchsia ones, because obviously this is the first book in the series. But I'm also noticing that there is a lot of foreshadowing, which is really cool. Yeah, so I've got post-its. I've already touched on the one about the teacher that was called Steve Leopard. That amused me somewhat. But in general, this book's reminding me of a lot of how I felt as a teenager first reading it. And I was a very depressed teenager. My mental health is only just getting to a good place now. But somehow, despite the fact that this series is linked to some of my darker days, not because this series actually did anything, like, this series is very much positive memories for me, but some of the things I did are inextricably linked to this series. I think the big thing that I want to touch on that I've noticed from reading Cirque Du Freak is how the way that the men and the boys within this book are portrayed is the opposite of toxic masculinity. So obviously Darren and his friends are fans of football and they like things like spiders and snakes, but also they cry when they're upset or when they're hurt, and it's never framed in a shameful way. I just really appreciate that despite this book being almost 20 years old, or over 20 years old in fact, masculinity is not toxic in this book, and I'm hoping the series continues. Like I say, I'm overdue a reread, so I can't actually comment on how well it stands up, but I remain optimistic at the moment anyway. Okay, so as past Effie was saying, this first book seems to have held up quite well. These boys are a little bit stereotypical in that they like spiders, they like snakes, they like football, but at the same time, they're very open with their emotions. There's a scene where one of the boys is hurt and he openly cries, and it does not seem as a shameful thing. It's just something he does. He's hurt, so he's going to cry. So far, I feel like this reread is going well, and I'm really looking forward to getting on to book 2, The Vampire's Assistant, which continues Darren's journey. I mentioned at the start of this video that I did another reread of this first book prior to putting this video up, and this time I took advantage of the fact that Audible has all of the audiobooks for the Saga of Darren Shan included in their subscription, at least in the UK. I will say the audiobook narrator is fantastic. He does a really good job of the accents, and I found him really great to listen to. What I did find quite interesting is clearly this audiobook is of the American edition of this book. And as I was reading physically alongside the audiobook, it was really weird to see the line edits where the book had been adapted for an international market. Predominantly, these were things like they changed trainers to cleats, football became soccer. There was also some currency changes. I think the most significant change was that 2 lines were removed when they were talking about money, as one of the characters made a comment about tuppence a halfpenny, which I don't think would translate into a conversation involving dollars. So those 2 lines were just completely removed. The other thing I noticed, and it could be a linguistic thing between British English and American English, is it felt like some of the words were somewhat dumbed down. The most obvious example of that was when they were talking about a bar of gold, and in this edition they say it's an ingot, whereas in the audiobook edition it's just described as a bar. I think it's unlikely that, at least on this reread, I'm going to be listening to the audiobooks for the rest of the series, as I'm going to be annotating, and I feel like it would be frustrating to have to keep pausing the audiobook so I could put annotations in. But I'm definitely interested to see the changes, and I am very glad to know that the audiobooks aren't abridged, which was my concern as they are quite short. Shorter than I expected, even considering that these are middle grade and around 200 pages each. And I hope that you continue along this journey with me. I'd love to know if you've read this series and what you thought of it. As I say, it is one of my all-time favourite series. I'm just not sure how well it holds up. My plan is to read all 12 of the original series. I also have the 4 books that follow Larten Crepsley, so I plan on reading them. And I will, in a few months anyway, have all 6 omnibus editions of the manga. So I'll be comparing the adaptation in the manga to the books as well. Until next time, bye!
There's a place in my heart